Welcome, everyone. This is a two-part video lecture on Plato's Republic, specifically focusing on the Guardian class. So we're going to run through what is the Guardian class, what do they do, how are they educated and cultivated, and what do they represent. In those familiar with Plato's Republic will know that the classes are reflective of the components of the soul. So the structure of the society is reflexive of the structure of the soul, and these two kind of feed into each other. I'm not going to say one determines the other entirely, but they feed into each other, and there's a kind of task of ordering of the soul, the harmony of different parts of the soul becomes the political task, I suppose you could say, of the harmony of different roles or classes in society. So we're going to focus on the Guardian class. And the Guardian class, by the way, is kind of two different classes in one. So obviously in Plato you have reason, desire, and spirit, and the Guardian class is not much to do with desire. Its role is actually in regulating desire, but it's, I suppose, a dynamic between spirit and reason. So you have the rulers, the philosophy rulers, who are the embodiment of reason, and you have the auxiliaries, who are the kind of embodiment of spirit. And they're kind of, auxiliaries are, primarily, I suppose you could say, they are a military class, a class of soldiers, but their relationship to the philosophy rulers is much different to what you might have today in, for example, in a society of like a liberal democracy, where you have a military and they're just told what to do, and no one really cares about the military if they've ever read Homer, or if they have wisdom or restraint. Maybe restraint's still important, but they're more or less just there to kind of carry out orders. And the auxiliaries and the philosophy rulers in Plato is the philosophy ruler has to go through the auxiliaries. So the philosophy ruler is entirely interested in what the auxiliaries do and how they're taught and their role, because they have to go through that. You don't get to be a philosophy ruler by being a businessman and being one of the appetitive classes of society, one of the someone who's interested in trade and commerce and so on. You get there through the auxiliaries. So you're talking about the Guardian, the auxiliaries, as being a class in which the philosophy king is born through or goes through to become. So that's something worth keeping in mind. So Guardian refers to basically a dynamic, I would say, anyway, a dynamic between philosophy rulers, reason, and spirit, the auxiliaries. The Greek word, and I don't speak Greek, so excuse me if I say this wrong, but phulake, I'm not sure how to say it, but this word is roughly translated to guardian, but it also could mean sentinel, or kind of watchkeeper, keeping watch. So this is an interesting word that we use, and think of things that are referred to as guard or guardian today. You have the newspaper in the UK, The Guardian, which is nowadays a pretty crappy newspaper, but it once wasn't too bad, and it once was called The Guardian, I think anyway. You have to ask someone more informed about this, but it would make sense to me, at least, if it was called that, because they were interested in the kind of watchkeeping of journalism, keeping a eye on what's going on with the powerful classes of capitalists and technocrats and whatever else. And also in Ireland, where I'm from, the police are referred to as the Gardaí, which is an Irish word for guardian. So you have kind of like journalists and police, and there's this kind of And obviously, guardian angel is another term we use in, I suppose, like religion. So you don't really have like a clear class of like people that are solely interested in, like security, right? So we're not talking about guardians in this sentinels, watchkeepers in the sense of people who simply stand at like a guard post watching, a prison inmates or watching a border to a country or something like that. The word guardian could be referred to as keeping an eye in general for something vaguer, something that maybe it would involve ethics or politics or virtue. So you have, but at the same time, the auxiliaries are in Plato's Republic legitimately soldiers. Like they're not merely journalists or something like that, right? They're not, and they're not. I don't know who would be like who would consider themselves like kind of moral guardians today. I don't know, like woke managers or NGOs or something like that. Not like these people are literally soldiers, but we have to keep in mind that Plato isn't like a military general. He's trying to construct a dynamic between certain virtues embodied in military life and soldiers, and in reason, and in the life of a philosopher. This is a dynamic we're talking about when we're talking about the word guardian. So the role of militancy and restraint and self-discipline in both the soul and society is one theme we're going to go over. The guardian's role in response to desire and appetite of motivations and economy. If anyone familiar with Phaedrus, Phaedrus, yeah, will know the famous analogy of a chariot, which is driven by a dark horse and a light horse, and reason is the charioteer, and the white horse is Thymos or spirit, who it's clear their role is in restraining the darker horse desire, which kind of tries to take over the whole time and get out of control. So you see this kind of metaphysics kind of being embodied in the Republic in a practical, embodied, system of social roles and education, and there's going to be a continued theme of regulating and controlling appetite and desire, so it doesn't take over. And we're going to look at how, maybe in part 2 more, we're going to look at this, but we're going to look at how reason needs spirit in order to control desire. For some reason, well, this is what we think today in a kind of rationalist technocracy. We think, well, it's a consumerist rationalist technocracy, which is the point. It doesn't have the spirited side is quite neglected. So why reason alone can't, even though reason is the kind of on the top. I don't want to say, like, I don't think the word top is it could be misleading, but the kind of spiritual hierarchy of Plato, reason is the highest, but it needs spirit to control desire, and that's something we're going to be looking at. Why does it need spirit? Why can't reason just control desire on its own? And the relationship between courage and wisdom, which I think is a kind of synthesis of the spirited side of the soul and the reason side of the soul, which is important. So the origins, the Guardians first appear in the Republic in the section titled Civilized Society. They emerge as the material capacity for luxury which trade bestows creates the danger for some form of social decadence where any sense or order and unity is lost. It is noteworthy that they do not emerge out of an external threat. The threat of neighbors wanting to take our land is mentioned, but only in the context of societies moving past material necessities towards unbound desire for luxury. So, in the Republic, we first come across this guardian class, or the mention of a guardian class and auxiliaries, in terms of, not, oh look, we're so rich and abundant, how do we protect our stuff from those pirates that are trying to steal our stuff? This is not security, right? This is different. Socrates mentions a kind of ethical degeneracy and decadence, which is and conflict, which could emerge through the material abundancy of a kind of higher civilization as they go. And that his assumption is, it's almost like an anthropological or historical kind of perspective, is that this occurs when societies competing for material abundancy start to come into contact and fight. And then inside a society itself, there's a kind of corruption from a disunity, which comes from people competing over material wealth. So you can see, as I mentioned in the introduction, the Guardian class sort of responding to this corruption and decadency, which is reflective, of course, of Phaedrus and the horses and the spirited horse Thymos needing to assist reason in regulating desire from taking over and getting out of control. The qualities for a guardian is he must be physically capable, have courage. One quote from Socrates is, "No horse or dog or any other creature can be courageous if he has no spirit." So this is interesting because sometimes I think maybe this happened more with Christianity, but there's a kind of vulgar need to distinguish human beings from animals. Of course, we're different animals, but there's something of a spirit which is noteworthy in Plato, which he mentions about animals. We constantly hear him referred to auxiliaries and guardians as like some sort of like guard dog, right? But this doesn't necessarily like today. If we refer to someone as a dog, we would think like, God, what are they like? Some sort of like idiot or something. But this is not what they mean. Like it's not an offense, or it's not it's not diminishing. There's a kind of virtuous aspect to the courage seen in kind of animal spirit. We still have that today. If you say like, something like he has the heart of a lion, or I can't think of any other analogies, but there's something animalistic which is necessary, which is maybe an energy which is necessary for a virtue. At least it creates the grounds for it. The task of Plato in cultivating this class is that they have this kind of not animalistic, but they have this high spirit, and they have this impulse, and they have this courage, but it doesn't take over and kind of lead to cruelty or tyranny, or perhaps stupidity. So the task here is that if guardians are cruel to their own people, this is not going to function. But they need, but if they lack thymotic spirit, this spirit we're talking about of a horse or a dog, of a courageous horse or a dog, and if they're too meek, well, then they can't be guardians. So there's a kind of fusion of different aspects of kind of receptiveness, concern, and gentleness towards their society, plus a sort of courage, impulse, maybe even ability to use aggression, or to embody something more less rational, detached, prudent, and so on. So we're talking about the fusion of opposing aspects, which is, in a sense, a kind of telos of that society or that individual. And it's through philosophy, which is the means by which these opposing traits are synthesized, unified. Energy or indignation and spirit with the receptiveness, care, and restraint. These are all combined. So this would create someone who is not meek or cowardly, but is also not like tyrannical and cruel and just like stupidly reckless. The analogy of a guard dog, again, this is a dog analogy, and it's not meant to be offensive or anything, which it is today, which is an interesting point. If we say like, you dog, well, actually that could also mean something else, but You know what I mean? It's like generally, I say, eight, 9 times out of 10, if we use dog, like bitch, for example, if we use dog metaphors, it's normally an insult. But interesting, in Republic, it's not. The analogy of a guard dog who can distinguish between a friend and foe is used as an example of this high spiritedness being infused with some sort of distinction or use of reason. And of course, this is the distinction between the nature of objects. There's a common theme in Plato in Lashes as well, another dialogue, where courage is not it. Courage is something which is kind of imbued with a certain knowledge or wisdom of what should be feared and what shouldn't be feared, and what should be endured and what shouldn't be endured, and perhaps more so when one should be scared, when one shouldn't be scared, when one should endure, pain, fear, when one should not give in to pleasure, a kind of seduction or corruption of pleasure seeking and so on. But this requires a sort of cognition or a kind of wisdom. This isn't merely a kind of practical utilitarian strength. This requires a certain wisdom. There's a few themes here. Obviously, is a unity, ordering of the soul and society, and achieving excellence. We need to order these parts of the soul in order to create someone who's not just cowardly and also not tyrannical and cruel, and is also, in a sense, wise, but not so wise that they're just calculated, because that could be cowardly. That's just like fight or flight mode. That kind of leads to a certain sort of cowardice at the same time. There's a cultivation of this class too, which is extremely important, which we're going to go into a little bit now. There's undoubtedly some themes here of breeding, cultivation, and similarly to our discussion on the Iliad, for instance, the last video I did, on the form and direction of this flow of potential seen in thymotic impulse. The last video I did on the Iliad was basically going over Achilles is constantly caught between like a kind of form of restraint and a outburst of anger. So he's refusing to participate in the war because he's constantly basically has this kind of indignation towards Agamemnon, who is not recognizing or respecting him, and then Patroclus dies, and you just kind of complete outburst of anger, of energy. So you have this constant flow of that kind of courage, and when this constant like conflict in Achilles of when it should and when it should not be applied, and you have like Athena intervening and saying to him, "No, don't be angry now, be angry later. Your time will come," and so on and so forth. So this is something maybe Plato might have picked up a little bit from Homer, despite him criticizing Homer in a lot of ways. Is in the kind of cultivation of this energy, how it should be used and how it should be formed. How does Plato see the education and cultivation of this social, spiritual end? It is directed by composing the proper relationship between reason and spirit. Again, so you have to think of it like this. This is ultimately the task of what he's trying to do. It's a certain relationship between spirit and reason, which is necessary for a becoming of a philosopher king. It's necessary for the regulation of desire, and it's necessary for the, cultivation or political keeping of a good, just society. One of the, more famous, kind of infamous, I should say, parts of Plato is his warning against the poets. So we get a little bit of insight here into why it is that he is skeptical of the poets. First section of education, the chapter on education, Socrates warns against the influence of the poets, seemingly out of fear of the inability to distinguish between analogy and reality. So Socrates kind of uses some pretty simplistic arguments that that people won't really understand. Um, I suppose like what's merely analogy and what's kind of instruction, um, which is kind of like a bit autistic of him, but it makes a little bit of sense as we go further. Um, and like, is this a simple conservatism? Like, oh, the Iliad depicts Achilles cursing his king, therefore we shouldn't. This is what Hobbes argued. Like, therefore we shouldn't show people this because they will mimic it. This is what Hobbes argued, and again, Hobbes was interested primarily in a sort of unity in a civil society, and against the kind of corruption of perpetual conflict. Although in a very different way, he went about it to Plato, but he takes up that task, right? But I suppose when I was reading this at first, I was wondering, is this kind of a really stupid, almost technocratic conservative side of Plato, where he just thinks, let's not let people read like Homer because it might influence them, make them have bad behavior or something. And there might be a little bit of that in there, but the motivation is actually much more complex, which we're going to go over. The justification later on, Socrates argues, is that we should only depict God as he really is. We can say that philosophy is trying to distinguish itself from poetry through an attempt to articulate God in a more pure or direct form, and not through and not some form of divinity which engages in the kinds of errors and in immortalities that humans do. And you kind of see a kind of proto turn to Christianity here from paganism, because paganism obviously depicts gods as being often deceitful or vengeful or maybe impure in some sort of sense, and interested in human affairs, whereas Socrates is arguing for a depiction of divinity and of God which is kind of more pure, more whole, and doesn't depict gods as engaging in the kind of imperfections and flaws which humans do. So maybe he's trying to kind of create a certain sense of verticality, a kind of higher distinction of God. Like, gods aren't kind of like just us, but more powerful. There's something more to them than simply exaggerated forms of ourselves. I guess he's trying to create a greater ontological distinction between gods and humans. So one quote in, I think it's the Iliad, but it could be the Odyssey, so I'm not sure. But one quote from Homer, he says, Zeus has two jars standing on the floor of his palace full of fates, good in one hand and evil in the other. This is used as an example by Socrates, of which Homer falsely attributes to God. God can only be good. He can't I suppose, like, determine a bad fate. Fate is pure. So, but why is this? Why is Socrates arguing this? And what has this got to do with cultivating a just society or a well-ordered soul? Well, in one passage where he argues something, I suppose, a more explicit attempt to cultivate courage, he talks about the kind of gloomy afterlife which the poets depict often in Homer and Hesiod, and he thinks this is unsuitable for the teaching of guardians how to be brave in the face of danger. And one quote, which is kind of pretty hardcore from him, he says that the guardians should prefer death in battle to defeat and slavery. So there's this sort of interest in, again, you see this reflexive relationship between metaphysics, ordering of the soul, forms, afterlife, eternity, and so on, and how we should construct and order things and educate and cultivate ourselves on, here in this planet. And so Plato is obviously clearly aware of how, like, conceptions of the afterlife, like, affect the way we behave on Earth. They have a kind of determining effect of how we carry ourselves and how we reason in life. And so he doesn't want the afterlife to be depicted as like stupid and gloomy. He doesn't want the gods to be depicted as making kind of stupid, irrational, corrupt decisions, because he wants the guardian class to be completely fearless in the face of death. He says that, basically, if you're doing the right thing, if you are doing something just, there's no reason to be worried. And I think he thinks that, this is my kind of interpretation, but I think that he thinks that the poets undermine or put doubt into that ability to achieve excellence, because they depict the metaphysical realm and the and what happens, when we die, as being somehow kind of nonsensical in a way, and he doesn't like this. So there's an important dynamic here between education and metaphysics, or the soul, and the way we think about and respond socially to the phenomena of desire, courage, reason. Because again, he's primarily interested in courage when he talks about the necessity for the poets to stop depicting things which involve divinity as being somehow nonsensical or gloomy. In a more explicit attempt, I very went over this. Sorry. Yeah. So one more point you see with the emergence of philosophers over poets is a kind of new relationship to how we perceive suffering and fear and desire. So again, think about the term guardian. The term guardian is keeping watch, and keeping watch for things which can corrupt or mislead. So this is, maybe he's kind of responding to a faculty in human reasoning as well, where we can become aware of, when we should be scared, when we shouldn't be scared, or perhaps we're scared but we still have to endure, and when our desire is leading us astray, and when suffering is terrible, but just to become hopeless or to give up is kind of not an option. There's a response to this kind of psychology, we could say, of humans, which forces us to kind of redirect or reinterpret, refocus, and revalue our metaphysical conceptions. This is a very interesting section, and any modern reader today would not any modern reader, but I would say, like, your general person reading this section today would probably be like, oh, this is like proto-fascistic or something. So this is interesting, but it's not interesting because I don't think it is proto-fascistic. I mean, this was ancient Greece. Fascism is a modern phenomenon, but you see again a pretty like the emphasis on self-discipline, and it's quite hardcore actually in certain parts of the Republic, and it's not something that I don't think many modern intellectuals and readers of Plato really focus on, which is why I'm making this video. Because I think perhaps they don't. Anyway, let's go through it first, and let's talk about why this is kind of ignored, maybe a bit later. But anyway, Plato seems to have in mind, when he talks about physical education, this chapter on physical education, he seems to have in mind health, athleticism, military, and character, kind of all in one. He isn't like your PE class in school, right? This is a sort of this is Plato addressing I suppose it's addressing suffering and purpose, and the relationship to chronic suffering and sickness, for example. Okay, here's a really interesting quote, and I thought this was very relevant to today's contemporary situation in the 21st century. But the prevalence of indiscipline and disease in a community leads, does it not, to the opening of law courts and surgeries in large numbers, and law and medicine begin to give themselves airs, especially when they are taken with great seriousness, even by free men. End quote. Okay, so give themselves airs, I presume, is a kind of term for like gives themselves too much, indulges themselves in too much status and power, and a kind of false sense of importance. So you have doctors and lawyers, you know, indulging themselves with too much self-importance and power and political decision-making power and so on. My God, he's just predicting the 21st century. Like, this is just insane. But this is interesting because this emerges from indiscipline and disease in a community. And I suppose the main focus here from this section, what I got from it anyway, was that he was trying to note the relationship between kind of chronic sickness and a kind of lack of purpose, or a kind of indiscipline which comes from a lack of purpose. So he basically attacks forms of hypochondria the whole time. And he dismisses medicine as being like what medicine shouldn't be for, according to Socrates in this section. It shouldn't be for treating chronic ailments. It should only be for treating things that can kind of be practically fixed quickly, not things that kind of just go on and on and on and on for years and years and years. And I think he sees this as more a kind of ethical degeneracy of a society, and a kind of corruption, or a kind of a disunification or disordering. It's almost like a symptom of a disordered soul. I mean, you kind of get this in psychoanalysis a little bit too. If someone says like I have headaches all the time, or I have stomach aches, and there's no clear-cut reason why, Freud would probably say like has something to do with hysteria or neurosis. And you can kind of see this in Plato a little bit too, because Socrates is arguing that people who are just chronically sick the whole time shouldn't really be treated by medicine. It should only be for people who need something which is kind of practical and clear cut, and anything beyond that is kind of excessive. And perhaps he's not totally arguing cruelty, although he does kind of say they should just be left to die. He actually does say this, but it could also be seen as a fear of doctors and lawyers stepping over their grounds, right? This is a philosophical society. This is not, if we have a kind of authority being propped up in terms of like doctors, and this kind of strange fetishizing of their authority, which became very common, I think, in modernity, with modern medicine kind of being a kind of pillar of science. And you see this obviously with 2020 and 2022, this kind of lockdown period, worshipping of doctors. This is kind of just basically like, for him, a sick society and a disordered soul, and a disordered civilization, which ultimately kind of like props up these kind of fake saviors, which are going to treat them indefinitely without really getting to the core of their suffering, and without really being able to kind of give them the opportunity, or the tools, or not the tools, but the ability to endure and overcome and live with purpose and overcome this kind of this chronic suffering. So that's a pretty interesting chapter, which would be dismissed today as being some sort of like I don't know what, like Satanism maybe, or something. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting chapter. So that's all of that for this slide. I'm going to do part 2, and we're going to focus more on desire and how the spirited side of the soul is necessary for reason to control desire. We're going to do that in part 2, so that'll be out soon enough. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed before, and see you next time.